In the cold stone halls of a Spanish fortress, a princess died. Not by sword, not by poison, but by hunger. Her name was Joanna of Castile, daughter of the legendary Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, the same rulers who sent Columbus across the ocean and united Spain under the cross. But behind their empire's glory was a family so consumed by power that love became a weapon. Joanna's crime was not treason. It was madness, or so they said. She wept too loudly for her dead husband. She trusted no one. She spoke to the shadows in the night, and for that, her own blood declared her unfit to rule. They locked her away, first in a convent, then in a tower, where she spent nearly 50 years in isolation, forgotten by the very dynasty she had birthed. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness, history whispers, was the most convenient excuse for a family that needed her crown. Before we open the gates of her prison and step into the flickering candlelight of her solitude, make sure to subscribe, because tonight we enter a royal tragedy so cruel, so quiet, it outlasted an empire. The winter of 1479 settled heavy over Castile. Cold, wind, and silence sweeping across the plains like an omen. Inside the royal palace of Toledo, the infant cries of a newborn princess echoed through the stone corridors. Her name was Juana, daughter of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the two monarchs whose marriage would forge a nation and ignite an empire. To the people, the birth was a blessing. To her parents, it was another piece on a chessboard, of destiny. Spain was not yet the unified kingdom we imagine today. It was a patchwork of crowns stitched together by conquest, faith, and fear. Isabella and Ferdinand had bounded under the banner of the cross, defeating the last Moorish stronghold of Granada, expelling Jews and Muslims, and sending their ships westward into oceans no European had yet conquered. They were the monarchs who turned faith into law, glory into governance, and blood into currency. And their daughter, Juana, was born to inherit the aftermath. From her earliest days, she was a child of contradictions, pious yet curious, obedient, yet restless. She prayed with the intensity of her mother, but questioned with the intellect of her father. Court tutors described her as brilliant, even prodigious. She spoke Latin before most courtiers could read. She debated theology with priests who later whispered that she knew too much for a woman, but brilliance in a princess is rarely a blessing. Isabella, though she loved her children fiercely, ruled them like soldiers. Her sons were bred for war, her daughters for marriage. Juana's elder sister, Isabella, was married to the heir of Portugal. Her younger sisters were promised to princes yet unseen. Each daughter was a bridge between nations, a tool of diplomacy bound by silk and sanctity. And Juana, with her sharp mind and inward gaze, unsettled her mother. She fasted to extremes, scourged herself in penance, and confessed daily, convinced that doubt was sin. Her tutors wrote that she often wept during Mass, not from piety, but from fear that her devotion was never enough. Isabella saw danger in that kind of mind. Passion and intelligence could not be trusted in a woman destined to obey. As Juana grew, so did the shadow of her parents' ambitions. The Spanish court was a place of prayers and executions, of incense and iron. The Inquisition's fires burned, not far from the palace, a constant reminder that her mother's rule was built on absolute faith. Her childhood lullabies were hymns. Her bedtime stories were martyrdoms. She learned early that silence was safety. But the silence hid something else, a storm inside her that no crown could contain. She was emotional, volatile, prone to fits of laughter that turned to tears without warning. Her mother called it sensitivity. Her confessors called it weakness. History would later call it madness. When she was 16, Isabella summoned her to the royal chambers. The queen, aging but still formidable, handed her daughter a parchment sealed in crimson wax. "Juana," she said softly, "you are to wed Philip of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, son of Emperor Maximilian. This marriage will unite Spain and the Empire under one faith, one dynasty." Juana bowed her head. She did not speak. She had never met him. Her mother placed a hand on her cheek, warm, firm, final. "You are the blood of queens. You will do your duty." That night, Juana wept not from disobedience, but from understanding. In her world, a daughter's heart was not her own. It belonged first to God, then to her father, and finally to the man she would be told to love. Within weeks, the preparations began. The Spanish fleet glittered in the harbor like a floating cathedral. Courtiers whispered about her beauty, her intellect, her solemn demeanor. Some said she would make Spain proud. Others said she was too fragile for the north. In October 1496, under a sky streaked with pale light, Juana boarded her ship bound for Flanders. The wind smelled of salt and destiny. Behind her, Spain receded into mist, the land of her mother's, faith and her father's empire. Before her lay a foreign court, a cold husband, and a fate written not in stars, but in chains. As the sails filled and the coast disappeared, Juana pressed a hand to her heart and whispered a prayer. That duty would not devour her soul. History would not grant her that mercy. The winds of the north bit sharper than Juana had ever known. The sea crossing to Flanders had been brutal, weeks of storm, sickness, and sleeplessness. And by the time she arrived at the port of Liège, the Spanish princess who stepped onto Flemish soil was pale, trembling, and unprepared for what awaited her. Her betrothed, Philip of Habsburg, stood at the center of a vast, welcoming crowd. The Archduke of Austria, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, he was everything his title promised, golden-haired, broad-shouldered, and impossibly handsome. His courtiers called him Philip the Handsome, and he knew it. His beauty was a weapon, honed as sharply as any blade. When their eyes met for the first time, something unexpected happened. Something no treaty could predict. They fell violently, recklessly in love. Their marriage, meant as a political alliance, became a collision of obsession and fire. Chroniclers wrote that Philip was so consumed by desire that he demanded the ceremony be performed immediately upon meeting her, refusing to wait for the official procession. Juana, who had spent her life obeying others, obeyed again, this time to her own undoing. Their union began not with diplomacy, but with passion that bordered on madness. Within days, courtiers whispered that the princess and her new husband barely left their chambers. Their attendants were dismissed for hours, even days. The same chroniclers who praised Philip's handsomeness now began to whisper about Juana's intensity, how she clung to him, how she wept when he left the room, how she watched him with eyes that burned. Love had become possession. And possession, in the Habsburg court, was treason. Because Philip was not built for devotion. He was charming, brilliant, and cruel in the way only men born to power can be. His court in Flanders was a theater of indulgence, music, hunting, feasts, and endless. Women, Juana, the foreign bride from Spain, devout and suspicious, did not understand the games of flirtation and deceit that governed court life. When she confronted him about his infidelities, Philip laughed. When she wept, he grew cold. The courtiers saw it all and began to call her La Loca, the mad one. But madness, for Juana, was not insanity. It was heartbreak, stripped of dignity. She had been raised in a palace of saints and soldiers. She had believed marriage sacred, eternal. To see her husband's lips on another woman's hands was not simply betrayal, it was blasphemy. And each humiliation carved deeper into her mind. There are letters, real ones, preserved in archives. where Spanish envoys describe the princess's despair. They say she refused to eat, refused to sleep, that she tore her hair out in grief. Some wrote that she attacked her husband in fits of rage, clawing his face until blood ran down his cheek. Others claim these were lies spread by Philip's courtiers to justify their control. The truth lies somewhere between cruelty and survival. Philip began to fear her power. As Isabella's daughter, Juana, carried the right to the Spanish throne, and that meant she could not be easily dismissed. If he wanted her crown, he needed her body, her name, and her silence. So he began to paint her as unstable, a woman unfit to rule, a wife unfit to govern her own emotions. And the world believed him, because in that age, a woman's fury was madness. A man's ambition was destiny. When word of Juana's behavior reached Spain, Queen Isabella's heart hardened. She wrote to her daughter urging restraint and obedience. "You must remember," she said, "that your husband is your lord and master. But how does one command the heart to kneel?" Juana's world became a cycle of passion and punishment, brief reconciliations followed by long humiliations. When Philip left her for weeks to chase political ambitions, she followed him, uninvited, across cities and countries, appearing at his side like a ghost that refused to be banished. There is a story, whispered through the centuries, that once, when Philip locked her in her chambers after an argument, Juana screamed until her voice broke, then sat in silence for 3 days. When he returned, she kissed his hand as if nothing had happened. Love, for her, had become a religion of pain. By 1504, Juana had borne him 6 children, among them Charles, the boy who would one day rule an empire greater than any the world had seen. But in her own lifetime, that son would inherit not her, love, but her prison. For now she was still a wife, the mad, jealous, desperate wife of Europe's most admired prince. And though the court mocked her, there was something in her eyes that terrified even her enemies, a defiance they could not explain. Because beneath her suffering, there was still a queen. And when death came for Philip, that defiance would become legend. Autumn of 1506. The bells of Burgos rang under a gray sky that never lifted. The air was thick with rot and the smell of sickness. Fever had swept through the Low Countries and followed the court back into Spain. Among those struck down was Philip the Handsome, the golden prince who once seemed untouchable. He was 28 years old. They said it began with a chill, a simple exhaustion from travel. Then came the fever. Within days, his skin was flushed and cold, his eyes sunken. Juana sat at his bedside, refusing to eat, refusing to move. Physicians surrounded them, muttering words that made her heart pound in her throat. "Contagion," they whispered. "No remedy." For hours she prayed, aloud, clutching his hand as his breath grew shallow. "You will not leave me," she repeated, as if the words alone could bind his soul to her. "You cannot leave me." By nightfall, the heir of the Holy Roman Empire was dead. They tried to take his body from her, but Juana screamed, a raw, animal sound that echoed through the palace. She locked herself in the room with his corpse, kissing his face, brushing his hair, whispering prayers that blurred into madness. When dawn broke, she still held him. Days passed. Courtiers begged her to allow burial. She refused. "He is not dead," she said. "He sleeps. His heart still beats." In her mind, it was not denial. It was devotion. She had loved him so deeply that death itself seemed unreal. If she could not save him in life, she would keep him in death. They placed his body in a coffin of lead and oak, sealed with wax and iron. Juana followed it everywhere. Through villages, over rivers, across the plains of Castile. Her caravan became a moving tomb, monks in front, soldiers behind, and the queen in black at the center, her eyes hollow, her lips whispering to the coffin as though it could hear. She refused to travel by day, saying the sunlight disturbed him. She insisted the coffin be opened at every stop so she could be certain he still rested peacefully. When priests protested, she dismissed them. When nobles tried to restrain her, she cursed them. In the Chronicles of Spain, this is where Juana becomes Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness is an easy word for what we do not understand. Was she insane? Perhaps. But what if she was not? What if her grief was something deeper? The final rebellion of a woman who had been denied everything but her own pain. Her father, King Ferdinand, saw opportunity in her breakdown. Queen Isabella had died 2 years earlier, leaving Castile to Juana. But a queen who would not bury her husband was a queen who could not rule. Ferdinand rode north with soldiers under the banner of filial concern. He met his daughter in the monastery of Santa Clara, where she had stopped to rest beside Philip's coffin. He found her sitting beside it in candlelight, her hands folded, her face calm. Too calm. "Daughter," he said softly, "you must let him go." She looked up at him with eyes that did not blink. "I am his wife," she whispered. "You are not." That night, while she slept, he ordered the coffin taken away under guard. When she woke, she screamed until her voice bled, calling his name over and over. The soldiers watched in silence, shifting uneasily. Even hardened men feared the sound. Her father declared her unfit to rule. He sent her away under guard, his own daughter, to the royal palace of Tordesillas, where he promised she would be cared for. She was 26 years old. Behind her, the body of Philip was entombed in the royal crypt. Before her stretched 50 years of isolation. The world outside would change, empires rise, continents discovered, her son Charles crowned emperor of half the known world. But Juana would remain frozen in grief, trapped in a single moment, of love and loss. And in that stillness, the legend of her madness would grow, whispered by courtiers, rewritten by kings, until no one remembered the woman she had been, only the prisoner she would become. The fortress of Tordesillas stood high above the river Duero, its walls thick, its windows narrow, its air cold even in summer. It was built not as a home, but as a cage disguised by courtesy. When Joanna arrived in the winter of 1509, she was no longer a queen. Her title remained, her blood was royal, but her life had been stripped of freedom, dignity, and name. The guards called her Su Majestad la Reina, but their voices trembled with irony. They knew she was a prisoner. Her father, King Ferdinand, told the court that confinement was mercy. "My daughter," he declared, "is too afflicted to govern. She is safer here, cared for by loyal servants." But the truth was simpler and crueler. He needed her out of the way. Her existence was an obstacle, her legitimacy a threat. He ordered her chambers sealed from the world. The queen's rooms were dim, the shutters nailed shut to protect her from the night air. She was allowed a single maid, a confessor, and a handful of guards. Each dawn she heard the bells of the convent across the river, and each night she whispered prayers no one answered. For the first few years she resisted. She demanded letters, couriers, news of her children, all denied. She asked to see Philip's coffin, claiming she could not rest until she prayed beside it again. Her father ignored her pleas. So she began to fast. Days without food, nights without rest. The guards begged her to eat. She refused. "If the world will not hear me," she said, "then God will." They called it madness, but even madness has a logic when the heart is broken and unseen. Years passed. The seasons bled into one another. Frost on the windows, summer flies in the dark. The fortress aged around her. Servants came and went, whispering stories of the ghostly queen who sang to herself in Latin and stared for hours at the floor. Sometimes she spoke to her mother's portrait, sometimes to Philip, sometimes to no one. When Ferdinand died in 1516, she expected release. Instead, the chains were reforged by a new hand, her son, Charles, now King of Spain and soon to be Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. He was 19 when he visited her for the first time. The boy she had once held in her arms now towered above her, a monarch trained to see affection as weakness. The chroniclers record that when he entered her chamber, she did not rise. She looked at him long and said, "You have your father's eyes." He did not flinch. The next day, the royal council declared her imprisonment necessary for the peace of Spain. Charles took her crown, her seal, her signature, everything. The young emperor ordered her isolation deepened. The windows were barred. The courtyard gates locked. Guards were forbidden to speak to her except to serve meals. She was allowed one confessor, a Dominican friar whose sermons echoed off stone walls. At night, she prayed aloud until her voice broke. The guards said they could hear her from the courtyard, reciting fragments of psalms, murmuring her children's names. As the years stretched into decades, the woman who had once been a princess of two empires became a rumor even within her own castle. The people of Tordesillas told stories that the queen refused to light candles, believing fire belonged only to the living, that she spoke to the wind through the cracks in her walls, calling it Philip's voice, that she still kept his shirt beside her bed, clutching it when the night grew cold. Whether these tales were truth or invention hardly mattered. They filled the silence that history left behind. By her 50th year in confinement, her body had begun to betray her. Arthritis curled her fingers, her eyesight dimmed, and her once thick hair fell in strands of gray. Her mind, that brilliant, inquisitive mind, remained alert enough to understand her captivity. And that perhaps was the cruelest fate of all, because Joanna was not insane. The few who spoke with her privately, confessors, secretaries, the occasional physician, left notes describing a woman lucid, intelligent, and deeply wounded. Her Majesty reasons well, one wrote, but her sorrow is bottomless. She spent her days walking in circles, muttering prayers, tracing the outline of her cell, as though searching for a door that no longer existed. Outside, her son ruled over an empire that spanned oceans. The Spanish Inquisition continued its march. Ships carried gold from the New World, and Spain's glory rose higher than ever, built, in part, on the silence of the mother they had entombed alive. In the winter of 1555, a priest found her sitting by the window, her hands clasped. She was thin as parchment, her eyes clouded but still burning with something unbroken. When he asked if she needed comfort, she said only, "Tell me, Father, do they still pray for the dead?" He bowed his head. "They do, Your Majesty." "Then," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "pray for the living. We are the ones forgotten." By the time the year 1555 bled into spring, the fortress of Tordesillas had grown old with its captive. The stones themselves seemed to sag, as though they too had tired of keeping their secret. Moss crawled between the cracks, ivy reached for the windows, and in the courtyard where grass once grew, nothing remained but dust. Inside, Juana of Castile sat by her window, her hands clasped in her lap. She was 75 years old. She had outlived her husband, her father, her mother, and nearly all those who had condemned her. Even her son, Emperor Charles V, was growing frail, his empire stretched thin, his victories turning to exhaustion. But she had seen none of it. For half a century, she had lived in silence, her only empire the width of her prison walls. The servants no longer called her Your Majesty. They whispered instead, La Fantasma de Castilla, the ghost of Castile. She was pale as ash, her movements slow and deliberate. her eyes still sharp beneath their veil of weariness. Sometimes, when the guards changed at night, they claimed to hear her singing, soft hymns in Latin, the words so faint they dissolved into air before reaching the end of the corridor. Her cell smelled of wax, dust, and the faint sweetness of lavender. In one corner stood a wooden crucifix worn smooth by her fingers. It was the only thing left she could touch freely. Everything else, her letters, her memories, her crown, belonged to others. She no longer spoke Philip's name. Not because she forgot, but because even love, when caged, turns into silence. In her final years, she refused confession. When priests asked why, she told them, God already knows the truth, even if men prefer their lies. That truth, of course, had long since been buried with her titles. The official story, the one written by clerks in golden script, was that Queen Joanna of Castile was mad, that she had been protected from her own instability, that her father and her son had saved the kingdom from her chaos. But history has a way of shifting when light finally reaches it. Modern scholars, centuries later, would read the letters, the reports, the confessions of her guards, and begin to see something else. Not a lunatic, but a woman erased by power. A queen who was too intelligent, too emotional, too human to fit the iron mold of monarchy. Her madness was convenient. Her silence, useful. Her confinement, essential. Because a living queen with a rightful claim could divide an empire. A grieving woman could be mocked. A mad one could be forgotten. And so, history forgot. In April of 1555, Joanna's body began to fail her. The cold that had never left the fortress seeped deeper into her bones. She stopped eating altogether, as if starvation, the slowest, quietest death, was her final act of will. The guards begged her to take broth. She refused. "If God has kept me this long," she murmured, "He can take me when He chooses." One night, as the moon hung low over the Duero, she asked for her confessor. When he arrived, she was calm, her face lit by the faint glow of a dying candle. "I have seen the world," she told him, "and it was not worth the cost." He asked if she wished for absolution. She smiled faintly. "For what sin?" She said, "For being born a daughter instead of a son." At dawn, she closed her eyes and never opened them again. Her body was carried quietly to the royal crypt beside Philip's, the man who had destroyed her and defined her in the same breath. They said that when the coffin was lowered, a gust of wind swept through the chapel, snuffing out every candle. The priests called it omen. The soldiers called it mercy. And then she was gone. The crown she never wore in freedom passed to her son, whose empire stretched across oceans, but no amount of gold or conquest could erase the shadow of the mother he had entombed. In time, even Charles would abdicate, retreating into a monastery, haunted by the same silence that had swallowed her life. Centuries later, when the archives opened and historians began to piece together her story, they found a different woman beneath the myth. Not the mad queen of legend, but a daughter crushed beneath duty, a wife consumed by love, a ruler undone by the men who feared her strength. Her tragedy was not madness. It was confinement, the deliberate, calculated suffocation of a woman, born in the wrong century. The people of Tordesillas still tell stories about her. On quiet nights, they say you can see a figure in white moving through the ruins of the old fortress, her veil trailing across the stone, her hand brushing the guy, walls that once imprisoned her. Some claim to hear her whisper, "Not mad, only forgotten." Perhaps that is her revenge, not to haunt, but to endure. Because even after 500 years, the name Juana la Loca still carries her echo. Not of insanity, but of sorrow, and of a truth too dangerous for her world to bear. The ghost of Castile never left. She merely outlived her jailers.